I wasn't planning on making this video, but I haven't made a rant video for a long time, so clearly I thought it was about time to rant a little bit. So today I'm going to be talking about Beowulf, and specifically the horrible translation that I just inflicted upon my ears earlier today. If you've never heard of Beowulf, here's a little background and also what it is in general about. So it is an Old English epic poem, and it follows this character, Beowulf, who's the hero of the Geats, and he defeats this horrible monster, Grendel, and then, of course, Grendel's mother decides she needs to seek revenge for her son's death, and so then he needs to kill her, and then he becomes the king of the Geats, and then Beowulf ends up dying and being mortally wounded to a dragon, and then he dies. But he lives an epic life of being a, hero. There's a lot of themes common to medieval and chivalrous type ideas. For example, the idea of good and evil and doing bad things and doing good things. Very, very many base themes. Now, I have read the poem a total of 3 times currently, and 2 of the 3 times were for school. So I read it in high school, and with that one, I'm not sure if I read the full thing or if it was just an excerpt, but I did read at least part of it. And that one, I do not know who translated it. When it came to in college, because I actually have the copy that I used in my college class because it was part of this Norton anthology. And for that one, I read the translation of Seamus Heaney. And so for sure, I've read 2 translations. I'm not sure about the one in high school because I don't have my copy anymore. I'm not sure quite where I read it. But let's talk about this recent translation that I read and absolutely despised. So it seems like Seamus Heaney is considered one of the best translations because not only have I seen it in Norton Anthology, but on Libby, which is an app connected to your library where you can listen to audiobooks and also get ebooks. I usually get audiobooks there. They had his translation in audiobook form, but it had long wait. So there was another translation that did not have a wait, and because I just wanted to listen to it, the audiobook itself was only about 4 hours, and so I decided to grab this, even though I had never heard of the translator, and I'll get to her in a minute. I do want to preface this saying that I realize that certain things are very hard to translate. One of those is, of course, a lot of the ancient classics. Think of the Iliad or the Odyssey. And one of the things that makes it hard to translate a text like Beowulf is that we don't really have an entire full copy of it. It was originally transmitted orally, so it would be told at pubs and in gathering places as a story, as an adventure fantasy story. But we do have it in the Noah Codex, and I'll show pictures of it here, but the problem with that is because of its age and not always being kept in the greatest conditions. Some of the text is missing or like part of the page is worn away. So translators, not only do they have the challenge of regular translating, but they also have the challenge of filling in the pieces of some of the text that is missing. So a lot of translators have made ridiculous connections between like different parts of text because the middle part is lost. So I'm not saying it is an easy job by any means to translate a text like Beowulf. However, I feel like even I could have done a better translation, and that's saying something considering I do not know Old English at all. So the translator that I read was Maria Headley, and I will show a picture of her translation. It's called A New Translation. And I find it important to read an introduction when it comes to a translated text like this, especially since I've already read other translations, because it's really important to get into the head of the translator to kind of understand and know how to approach the text, the translation that they wrote. Because if they said, oh yeah, I tried to translate it as perfectly as possible to the original text, but that means it's kind of archaic in its wording and it's kind of hard to understand. I want to know that going into the text. So I won't go into all the details, but in the introduction, she talks about how translations are never going to be perfect. And I agree with that. You can't have a perfect translation. You have to make sacrifices, whether you decide to focus more on lyricism or more on accuracy to the translation. You're going to need to make cuts kind of to the text. My first red flag I had in this introduction specifically is when she talks about J.R.R. Tolkien and his understanding of Beowulf. And I'll read the quote that she quotes by him. And he says, "If you wish to translate, not rewrite Beowulf, your language must be literary and traditional, not because it is now a long while since the poem was made, but because it speaks of things that have since become ancient, and because of the diction of Beowulf was poetic, archaic, and artificial, if you will, in the day the poem was made." So basically he's saying that you need to try to stick with traditional language in order to keep the translation as accurate as possible. And because of that, it is going to be harder for a modern audience to read. Now, she points out that she disagrees with him in that she doesn't think that you need to stay traditional and, as she calls it, courtly, as Tolkien is a proponent of. Instead, she makes some interesting changes, and you will see on the quote behind me. So let's get into the poem itself and why this translation is just so horrible. So I'm going to read you the first stanza of Beowulf as translated by Seamus Headley. So, so the Spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. All right, pretty basic, He's basically saying, okay, so long ago, there were these warriors, these great kings that, were famous. So, let's hear their story, kind of. That's how he starts off the translation. Now let me read her first line of this translation, which is very, very different. Bro, tell me you still know how to speak of kings. In the old days, everyone knew what men were. Brave, bold, glory-bound. Only stories now, but I'll sound the Spear Dane's song, hoarded by hungry times. All right, first of all, not quite as understandable. Considering her introduction talks about how her translation is trying to be, in a sense, as modern as possible, her translation definitely is less understandable than he is. I'm okay, so it starts off with bro, which is very confusing, and I'll get to why she argues that bro should be used. But it starts off with bro. Tell me you still know how to speak of kings. Speak of kings? What do you mean? We're speaking of kings, okay. In the days of old, everyone knew what men were. All right, that makes sense. Everyone knew what men were, not quite sure, but yeah. Only stories now, but I'll sound the Spear Dane's song, hoarded for hungry times. All right, so she's going to sound the songs and, tell the story. Again, I feel like this translation is not as clear for her being modern, but let me go back to bro because that really threw me off. And in her introduction, she gives a reasoning as to why she is using bro or more modern terms. So she says, I come equipped with my own memories of sitting at the bar's end, listening to men navigate darts, trivia, and women. And so in this book, I translate it as bro. The word white, I'm not sure how to translate it. Seamus Headley translated it as so. She even comments on his translation. Why does she translate it as bro? Depending on the tone, bro can render you family or foe. The poem is about that notion too. Martial pacts are made, catastrophes ensue, kingdoms are offered and rejected, familiar bonds are ensured not with blood but with gold. When I use bro elsewhere in the poem, whether in the voice of Beowulf, Hrothgar, or the narrator, it's to keep us thinking of the ways that family can be sealed by a formulation. Basically, deep down, she's saying, you need to understand why I'm using bro, because in this context, understanding Beowulf and the world it came from, it makes no sense to use bro. So she's basically retelling it in a modern terminology. And yet she still uses, all the names and everything like that of the olden times. Like Beowulf is still Beowulf. So it's retelling. It's not a retelling. It's translation. And when it's a translation, you have to say, okay, let's keep as closely to the original story while also translating in a way that is understandable to a modern audience. But she's ignoring that, keeping true to the translation. You wouldn't get a gist of the era in which this story was written or originally told. You would only get an idea of like the modern day with random plot marks of the medieval stuff thrown into there. Some of her understanding of women in Beowulf is quite interesting. So she takes a look at Beowulf very much from a feminist lens, which I don't think is necessarily wrong. But when it comes to translation, I personally think you have to try to be as unbiased as possible, because you're trying to capture what that original author or writer or story captured, as opposed to like what you physically believe. A good example is the Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which I've heard is quite good. I haven't read it yet. But in that one, she retells the Iliad, but from the perspectives mostly of women. And that one is very much a feminist retelling. And I have no problem with that, because she's taking the original story and retelling it in a very different way. She's not saying, okay, I'm going to translate the Iliad, but honestly, I'm just going to get rid of all the like characters of all the men characters and just have the women characters because, feminism. She's not doing that. She's retelling an interesting story just from a feminine lens, from the female characters' perspectives. Another example in general would be looking at Beowulf, but writing an essay, writing a scholarly paper, examining the female characters in it. And in Headley's introduction, she talks about that. She talks about how female characters were maybe misrepresented. For example, Grendel's mother, who is this horrible hag. She's described as a monster. Beowulf, of course, kills her. But Headley points out that, well, yeah, but she was also just a mother who's trying to seek revenge for her murdered son. Yeah, her son was kind of horrible, and so was she, to be honest. But you can understand her a little bit more looking at that from her perspective, saying, yes, she's just, seen her son murdered, and so she's seeking revenge on the people who murdered him. And so I think that gives a little bit more depth to her character. So I think writing a analysis of Beowulf, if Headley had done that, I think I would have enjoyed it, to see that feminine lens of Beowulf. However, she tries to insert that more into Beowulf itself and use her ideology to affect how she translates an original text. And that is where I draw the line. And of course, there's always biases when it comes to translations. Like she said, like I said, translations are never going to be perfect, but I think you can still try to stay as unbiased as possible when it comes to translations. And that's why I think this translation sucked so badly, which is probably why there wasn't a wait for it at the library, because everyone else hated it too. So to finish off this video, I'm going to read the very end of the Seamus Henley translation, and then I'm going to read the very end of the Maria Headley translation. This is the Shameless Henny translation. So the Geat people, his hearth companions, sorrowed for the Lord who had been laid low. They said that of all the kings upon the earth, he was the man who's most gracious and fair-minded, kindest to his people and keenest to win fame. Now let's compare again. They did all this grieving the way men do. But bro, no man knows, not me, not you, how to get to goodbye. His guys tried. They remembered the right words. Our king, lonely ring wielder, inheritor of everything, he was our man, but every man dies. Here he is now. Here our best boy lies. He rode hard. He stayed thirsty. He was the man. He was the man. I mean, what does that even mean? He was what man? What do you mean he was the man? The archetypal man. But I haven't read her other books, so maybe her other books are better, but I just think her translation of Beowulf failed. in many ways. But I'm curious, have you read Beowulf? Have you read specifically this translation of Beowulf? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!